a hit worth tens of millions of dollars. Ukrainian drone operators, the special unit Lazargrad, and the National Guard of Ukraine destroyed an expensive Russian Yastreb AV radar station. The operation was carried out in the Luhansk region. The military emphasizes that it was deep behind the front line. The estimated value of the destroyed equipment is at least $50 million, and the precise strikes were carried out using heavy bombers.
After the first accurate drop, the Russians tried to save the equipment. However, the fighters from Lazar's group showed creativity and tracked the movement of the radar station. Our pilot landed the bomber right on the Yastreb, and thanks to this, Lazar moved from the station along the route. With the following strikes, the fighters completely destroyed the radar station. From a message by the special unit Lazar's group of the National Guard of Ukraine on Telegram.
Ukrainian border guards reported a successful hunt for Russian equipment in the northern Slobozhansky and Kursk directions. Drone pilots from the Steel Border Brigade destroyed 2 cannons, several communication antennas, and an enemy vehicle. 4 Russian military shelters and an ammunition depot also came under targeted strikes. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine counted 65 combat engagements since the start of the day, almost a quarter of all Russian assaults. They took place on the Konstantinovka bridgehead. The enemy tried to break through the Ukrainian defenses 15 times. On the Pokrovsk section of the front and in the Hulyapoli area, the defense forces repelled 14 attacks by the invaders. And in the Sumy region, the Russian Sever group is trying to create a buffer zone, which the Kremlin calls a security zone, according to analysts. And they note that the occupying forces are operating primarily in the gray zone, where there is no physical presence of the Ukrainian army, and they are also actively using drones and aviation for strikes.
This attempt is not just to distract us from something else. On other sections of the front, particularly in Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia. Accordingly, it's also an attempt to draw our reserves here. That's why there will continue to be activity in the Sumy region in the near future. 100%. But really, once again, the North Group today is sending its reserves, sending its units, including to other locations on the front. It simply isn't capable of advancing or attacking along a wide front.
Nearly 1,000 Russian soldiers were eliminated by the defense forces over the past day. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the total combat losses of the Russian army since the start of the full-scale invasion are already nearly 1,276,000 people. Ukrainian defenders destroyed 5 tanks, 3 armored fighting vehicles, more than 60 artillery systems, and 1 multiple rocket launcher system. They also took out over 2,000 drones and more than 280 units of Russian vehicles and special equipment.
So, the situation on the front. We'll discuss it with our guest, Pavlo Lekachuk, head of military security programs at the Center for Global Studies, Strategy 21. He is joining us remotely. Hello, Pavlo.
Greetings and glory to Ukraine.
Good afternoon. Glory to the heroes.
Pavlo, how would you assess the situation today? Where is it most critical right now? If we look at the Russian troops' assault operations, in terms of numbers, the Pokrovsk direction still remains the main one. However, as noted by the General Staff, overall, the number of Russian attacks has decreased. How do you assess this?
It's tough for the Russians, too. That's why the situation on the battlefield is changing. After prolonged and intense months-long fighting for Pokrovsk-Smyrnograd, the Russians have practically taken Pokrovsk-Smyrnograd. Now they need to advance northward. What was the point of all these battles? It was to get behind our group's lines. But now, they no longer have the means to get behind the Ukrainian armed forces grouping in Donbass. Moreover, they have to redeploy some of their forces to other directions because things are just as intense in the south. Ukraine's defense forces are carrying out counterattacks north of Hulyapol. So the Russians have to transfer reserves and resources there from Donbass. But this shows which areas are hotspots for them. On the other hand, Ukraine is also launching counterattacks near Alexandrivka. In the Zaporizhia direction, in the southeast of the Zaporizhia front, they are not treating it as secondary. Donbass, northwestern Donbass. There are just attempts to encircle and cut off the entire group of forces, but these are replaced by attempts at frontal pressure. Advancement along the front. And here, the key point becomes Kostiantinivka, which they're also trying to encircle, but it's a tactical encirclement from three sides. Right now, Kostiantinivka is probably the hottest spot on the entire front line. Well, of course, that doesn't mean that. Well, it's even hard to calculate the ratio there. It's hard there, too. Gulyaipol is hard. Konstantinov, Kelemon. Now the Russians are trying to wedge themselves in the north, in the Sumy region and partly in the Kharkiv region, to wedge themselves into ours, to break through the border. For what? In order to prevent us from maneuvering our resources, stretching our defense forces. This shows that they also don't have enough resources, and somehow they'll have to regroup, obviously, to build up their resources. To call this a lull, a spring lull, even the words don't come out right. But obviously, in the spring, something like a significant new wave of military assaults could potentially be launched if the occupiers manage to locate additional reserves to further expand the scale of their ongoing attacks.
Pavel, so overall, how would you assess the Russian army's ability to actually try to accumulate the necessary resources and personnel, as you mentioned, reserves, since they're constantly talking about a spring offensive again? Basically, I'll point out, or just remind our viewers, in case anyone has forgotten, that essentially every year we talk about spring, summer, winter, and so on, and about the enemy's plans to launch an offensive. But, as I like to say, wanting something and being able to do it are two completely different things. So, how would you assess the statements and information we're receiving about preparations for a new large-scale, this spring offensive?
I wouldn't tie it to the seasons. Yes,
Pavel, yes.
the Russians are building up resources there, preparing for an offensive operation. They're determining the timing, figuring out how many resources to allocate for each stage. Then all of that gets thrown into battle. And then the first period, when resources are planned out for 3 to 4 months, but they're being used up today. You can throw in additional reserves, you can bring in extra ammunition. These are the most intense periods of enemy activity. And then it turns out that the resources meant for future operations have already been used up. Pokrovsk-Myrnograd, yes, and now there's nowhere to get more. That's why the intensity of the fighting drops off a bit. Russian generals, the general staff, run to the Kremlin to ask Putin for additional resources. At these annual meetings, Putin tells them, at the Ministry of Defense's reporting and election meetings, at the Defense Ministry board meetings, every time he says, you guys are doing a good job, but I'm not giving you any more resources. Make do with what you have. Well, that is the fundamental reason why we see this distinctive wave-like pattern and curve, and that is exactly how these processes could potentially keep going moving forward.
Do you agree with the conclusions of the Institute for the Study of War analysts that the Kremlin will have to abandon its plan for spring-summer offensive? I'll even quote here that Ukrainian forces are successfully counterattacking, not only in the Alexandrovka and Gulyaipol directions, but also in the western part of the Zaporizhia region. And these counterattacks have a tactical, operational, and strategic impact that could disrupt Russia's offensive campaign plan this spring and summer. How do you assess these possibilities? And let's say, what red flags, so to speak, will we see that indicate Russia has run out of steam and is stopping its offensive?
Based on the observations of the strategic maneuvers in the Russian rear, it appears they are now actively attempting to assemble and organize a group of forces in order to continue their offensive operations. The question is that depending on the resources they manage to accumulate each time and on the activity of the defense forces, the scale of this offensive can change. If a month ago it was possible to assess where they would attack from, either from the south or from the east in Donbass, confirming Putin's statements that he supposedly desperately needs Kramatorsk and Sloviansk and would stop there, or whether they would shift the main direction of their offensive to the south, thereby contradicting those claims. This essentially confirms the fact that Putin will exert pressure in every possible location, or that he might simultaneously launch an offensive from two different directions at once. Now, it's certainly within the realm of possibility that, given their limited resources, the Russians might narrow the width of the active offensive front. They might even switch to defense there. Well, most likely, they'll probably try to continue the offensive on a narrower front. We talked about how Russia's advantage is that they have a lot of manpower, a lot of material resources compared to Ukraine's defense forces. That's why they can stretch our defenses, while also having the ability to concentrate their forces and resources in the direction of the main strike. But now, the width of the front, the active front, is going to narrow. Or, on the contrary, there might not be a main direction of attack at all. Basically, they might say, well, okay, we won't actually be able to capture or bite off those regions of Ukraine that they claimed, and instead they'll just terrorize. With small cuts all along the front line, all along the border, all along the line of contact from Chernihiv to Kherson.
Tell me, in your opinion, how noticeable is the effect of the Ukrainian campaign of strikes on the enemy's rear right now? We're talking about logistics centers, warehouses, oil and military infrastructure. Even recalling that story with Bryansk, the silicon electronics, essentially, that were involved in producing the much needed electronics used in the Russian Federation's arms industry, including their missile programs. How would we try, from what positions should we approach this to understand just how painful these strikes are for the Russian Federation?
Well, I'd break it down here into two components, and not even by range, but by targeting purpose.
Although that's an important factor, you have to admit.
I agree. The first group of targets are those that directly support the Russian war machine. These are depots, airfields, ammunition storage facilities, and fuel and lubricants warehouses. These are factories that directly produce shells, ammunition, missiles, and so on. That's all pretty clear. The Russians have a schedule, a chart for the delivery of the relevant munitions, basically from the factory to a specific battalion. And when an arsenal gets knocked out here, somewhere, or in the area where those same Shahed drone warehouses are, trucks from the brigade come to pick up ammunition. They're told, there's no ammunition for you, you're free to go, and there won't be any for a week. Wait until they bring it from the Far East. That's a direct correlation. A strike. The result on the battlefield is almost instantaneous. They're targets of a military economic nature. These are the targets that create the stream of bloody petrodollars that feed this Russian war machine. They aren't directly connected to today's battlefield, but they ensure its future operations. So Russian oil isn't just about gasoline and diesel. And rocket fuel, this is exactly that same stream of dollars. And when a Russian oil refinery gets hit, they have to repair it, it stops working, and instead of spending money on the army, on those mercenaries being recruited into the Russian army, the money just isn't being made. From that enterprise, the money gets sucked away like a vacuum in the opposite direction.
Absolutely. That's a fact, yeah.
It's no less important.
Subscribe to UATV English and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.